Ellen DeGeneres, an unstoppable force who turned daytime television into a sanctuary of joy, was a fearless pioneer whose laughter became a lifeline for millions. The radiant soul behind the Ellen DeGeneres Show and the unforgettable voice of Dory stood tall as a giant of courage and charisma, rewriting the boundaries of what was possible in American culture. She carried the weight of breaking barriers, her talent, contributions, and courage undeniable. But the higher she rose, the deeper the wounds became. The louder the praise, the harsher the scrutiny. She became one of the rare artists both celebrated as an icon and crushed by the brutal judgment of a world not yet ready to embrace her truth. And if the storms of the past nearly destroyed her, the tempest surrounding her at 67 is darker, more relentless, like a shadow that refuses to let go. What remains hidden behind the smile that once conquered America, what still echoes in the final chapter of a journey both glorious and tragic, we will uncover together. Whether you admire or question her, if she ever left a mark in your memory, leave a like as a way to honor a journey both radiant and storm-torn. There are homes that breathe warmth, and there are homes where silence crushes like a stone, and for Ellen DeGeneres, that silence was not peace. It was heartbreaking. It was cruel. It was a wound that bled in silence. Born on January 26, 1958, in Metairie, Louisiana, into a modest middle-class family with her father Elliot working in insurance and her mother Betty keeping the home. Ellen was the youngest of two children with an older brother, Vance, who would one day also walk the path of entertainment. But the ordinary comfort of family fractured in 1973 when her parents divorced, and at just 15, she saw the foundation of her world collapse. The family split apart, Vance staying with their father while Ellen followed her mother into a new marriage and a new house in Atlanta, Texas. Instead of safety, those walls hid secrets and shadows that pressed against her young heart until she could hardly breathe. As a teenager, Ellen endured a betrayal so tragic it would mark her forever. A stepfather who crossed boundaries that should never be crossed with a child. A violation of trust from the very person who should have protected her, an ordeal no child should ever face. It was cruel. It was heartbreaking. And it left scars she would carry for decades. The agony was compounded by timing. Her mother Betty was in the fight of her life. Battling breast cancer, her body frail, her spirit weighed down by illness. Unable to imagine that her own husband could be the source of her daughter's pain. Ellen, desperate and broken, turned to her mother for belief, for protection, for one voice to stand with her. But her words were met with disbelief, not because her mother did not love her, but because the truth was too unbearable, too unthinkable for a woman already drowning in her own suffering. That disbelief cut deeper than the betrayal itself, leaving Ellen with the unbearable weight of isolation and leaving Betty with a guilt that would haunt her for years, a tragedy of two souls, mother and daughter, both crushed by pain, both scarred by the shadows of one man's cruelty. Years later, Ellen would confess that the pain carved itself into her very soul. She admitted that learning to dance through life while crying inside was the hardest act she ever performed. The irony was bitter and tragic. The world would one day celebrate her as a beacon of laughter, yet her first lessons in survival were not born from joy, but from silence, fear, and broken trust. The loneliness of her adolescence became unbearable, a cage built of family photographs that showed smiles while chaos reigned behind them. Ellen knew too soon that not every picture told the truth, and those hidden wounds became shadows she carried into adulthood, shadows that haunted her even as she stepped toward the spotlight. And yet, in the ashes of that heartbreak, something unexpected began to grow. Humor, sharp, quick, self-deprecating, emerged not as a pastime but as a shield, her only weapon against the darkness that tried to consume her. Laughter became her survival, her defiance, her rebellion against cruelty. On nights when tears threatened to drown her spirit, Ellen sharpened her wit like armor, transforming betrayal into rhythm, silence into stories, wounds into punchlines that would one day make the world double over in laughter. This was not joy born of privilege, but of necessity. Her comedy was never just entertainment. It was escape, resilience, and a refusal to let cruelty define her. The wounds of her childhood shaped her, scarred her, and nearly silenced her forever. But Ellen DeGeneres refused to stay silent. From the ashes of broken trust, she built a voice that the world would one day celebrate, even though it had almost been lost to the tragic shadows of her youth. And from that pain, a stage was waiting, a destiny where laughter would become not just survival but her calling to the world. The girl who once carried shadows in silence stepped into adulthood with nothing more than a battered spirit and a stubborn will to survive. In 1976, Ellen DeGeneres walked away from the University of New Orleans after only one semester, carrying no diploma in her hands but a storm in her heart. Determined to find a path of her own, she returned to New Orleans, a city that pulsed with music and laughter, yet for her, it was a battlefield of survival. Rent overdue, cupboards echoing empty, dignity slipping through her fingers. Ellen took whatever job she could find because hunger and unpaid bills were as real as the air she breathed. She typed endlessly as a secretary in a law office until her fingers ached, folded endless piles of clothes at J.C. Penney until her back stiffened, painted murals with paint-stained hands that would not wash clean, carried heavy trays through smoky diners as a waitress, poured drinks late into the night behind a bar where laughter belonged to others but never to her. Every paycheck a fragile lifeline, every shift a battlefield that drained her body but stole her soul. Every hour worked a reminder that dreams are not given. They are bled for. But poverty did not just test her, it forged her. She learned to stretch a few crumpled dollars across a week, to ration bread like treasure, to swallow hunger while saving coins for bus fare, to smile at strangers across counters while her stomach twisted in emptiness. Even in those bone-weary days of endless labor, when her back throbbed from carrying trays and her pockets jingled with nothing but loose change, a voice inside her whispered that she was meant for something greater. She carried a battered notebook stained with coffee and sweat, filled with scribbled jokes, fragments of absurdity, sketches of pain disguised as humor, seeds of a future no one else could see. At night, in a cramped, rented room with peeling walls and a flickering lamp that buzzed like a tired insect, she would rehearse alone, her shadow cast against the wall like a second silent audience. Sometimes she performed to a cracked mirror, sometimes to her pet, the only witness to a young woman turning heartbreak into laughter, hunger into punchlines, loneliness into rhythm. Those were nights of heartbreaking solitude when dinner was nothing more than half a sandwich saved from work, when the applause existed only in her imagination, and the silence of the room pressed heavier than the day's labor. Yet she sharpened her humor like a blade, slicing through despair with timing and wit, certain that one day the world would have no choice but to listen. Each line she scribbled, each joke she practiced, was not just comedy. It was survival, resilience, defiance. She was teaching herself discipline, timing, courage, endurance, all forged in the furnace of struggle, all born from nights where the world forgot her. But she refused to forget herself. By the early 1980s, Ellen began stepping onto the dimly lit stages of New Orleans. Smoky clubs and rundown bars where laughter was scarce. Audiences were impatient, and failure was often paid in silence. She was not polished, not yet confident, but her style was different. Quick, intelligent, self-deprecating. She turned scars into punchlines, doubts into comedy, loneliness into rhythm. Sometimes the room was half empty. Sometimes no one laughed, and she would walk home with tips barely enough for rent, clutching coins that jingled like cruel reminders of her struggle. But she refused to stop because every joke was rebellion, every laugh a victory against the silence that once tried to crush her. Her breakthrough did not come through luck, but through persistence that caught the eye of scouts searching for fresh talent. In New Orleans, she was whispered about as the funniest person nobody knew, her name spreading like a secret carried from club to club until it reached the ears of those who booked the holy grail of comedy, The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. And then, in 1986, destiny called. For a young comedian, there was no higher honor, no greater test. This was the stage where legends were made, and only Carson himself had the power to decide who was worthy. Ellen walked onto that stage with trembling hands and a pounding heart. But inside, she carried the scars of her youth, the resilience of her hunger years, and the wit she had sharpened alone in a room of shadows. Her set was sharp, effortless, disarming, and the moment of truth came when Johnny Carson himself, with that knowing smile, beckoned her to join him on the couch, inviting her into the sacred space reserved only for the rarest talents. In that instant, Carson became the gatekeeper of her destiny, the man who validated not just her jokes, but her very existence as a voice that America could no longer ignore. That night was not just a performance. It was redemption written in laughter, a girl who had once been silenced, proving that her voice could command a nation. The applause was not just for the jokes, but for the journey. The waitress balancing trays in smoky diners, the painter with paint-stained hands, the lonely young woman rehearsing to a cracked mirror, now standing under the brightest lights with America listening. From that night forward, Ellen DeGeneres was no longer just a survivor. She was a rising star, carrying with her the unshakable truth that even the deepest wounds can become the sharpest tools of creation. By the mid-1990s, Ellen DeGeneres had climbed from the back rooms of smoky clubs to the glittering promise of primetime television, and every step was earned through years of grinding persistence. She had been the guest who stole scenes on late-night stages, the comic whose sharp timing turned silence into laughter, and brick by brick, she built the credibility that finally won her the impossible, a sitcom of her own, simply titled Ellen. It was more than a show. It was a coronation, the story of a girl who once scribbled jokes in a battered notebook, now commanding the laughter of a nation. For a moment, it seemed as though destiny had finally rewarded her long struggle, but fate had a more ruthless test waiting. In 1997 came the puppy episode, the moment that would etch her name into cultural history. On screen, Ellen's character said the words that mirrored the secret she had carried for years. She was gay. And off-screen, Ellen herself chose to step into the same truth. It was groundbreaking. It was courageous. It was the raw honesty of a woman tired of hiding, but it was also terrifying. Behind the applause, Ellen knew the risk to speak her truth was to gamble her career, her reputation, perhaps everything she had fought so hard to build. The moment was electric, but the fallout was merciless. Advertisers vanished, sponsors fled, conservative voices sharpened their knives, and ratings fell like a stone. Headlines that once celebrated her turned cruel, mocking, vindictive. In 1998, Ellen was canceled. Not because it lacked talent or humor, but because the world was not yet ready for a woman brave enough to live openly. The cost was staggering. Overnight, Ellen transformed from one of America's brightest stars into a pariah, shunned by Hollywood, left to walk through the wilderness of her own truth. It was heartbreaking. It was brutal. The silence that had once haunted her childhood returned, this time amplified by a culture that chose to punish rather than applaud. And yet, within that devastation lay the seed of a greater legacy. For Ellen's fall was not failure. It was the sacrifice demanded of pioneers, the price of authenticity in a world still chained by prejudice. But Ellen was not a woman to stay buried in silence. She had survived too much already. Rejection had broken many before her, but she refused to surrender. Step by painful step, she rebuilt her life, performing on small stages, taking voiceover work, doing whatever it took to remind the world she still had something to give. Like a phoenix rising from ashes, she fought her way back until in 2003, she finally stepped onto a stage that would change everything. The Ellen DeGeneres Show. What began as a gamble by networks uncertain of her appeal became a cultural phenomenon, and Ellen transformed daytime television into a cathedral of joy, where laughter, kindness, and dancing became her signature. For nearly 2 decades, she ruled daytime, winning dozens of Daytime Emmy Awards and creating a space where millions found comfort, escape, and inspiration. Her voice carried far beyond the walls of her studio. In 2003, she gave life to Dory in Pixar's Finding Nemo, a character so beloved that she reprised the role more than a decade later in Finding Dory. She became a trusted host for the most glamorous nights in entertainment, guiding the Academy Awards, the Grammys, and the Emmys with effortless charm and wit. And in 2016, her journey came full circle when President Barack Obama placed the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck, the highest civilian honor in the United States. recognizing not only her talent but her courage, her impact, and her unshakable spirit. The irony was staggering. In 1997, honesty had nearly destroyed her, but by 2016, that same honesty made her a national treasure. The truth that once cost her everything became the foundation of her legacy, a beacon for millions who felt unseen, unheard, unaccepted. Ellen had walked through the storm of rejection, but she emerged as one of America's most beloved figures, living proof that resilience can transform tragedy into triumph. Her journey from cancellation to celebration, from being silenced to being honored by a president, was not just the arc of a career. It was the arc of a life that dared to be authentic, no matter the cost. For every laugh she shared and every tear she shed, Ellen DeGeneres carved her place not just in entertainment, but in the heart of a nation that finally learned to applaud her truth. Storms often begin with whispers, but for Ellen DeGeneres, the storm that would change everything began with a tweet. On March 20th, 2020, as the world sat in lockdown, longing for comfort and connection, comedian Kevin T. Porter posted a message that looked like a joke but struck like a spark in dry grass. He wrote, "Right now, we all need a little kindness. You know, like Ellen DeGeneres always talks about. She's also notoriously one of the meanest people alive. Respond with your stories and I'll donate to the LA Food Bank." The internet, restless and hungry for stories during quarantine, erupted. Replies poured in by the hundreds, then the thousands. Baristas, waitresses, audience members, even people who had once worked on the show. Story after story painted a portrait that jarred with the smiling figure who had built an empire on kindness. Some recalled being told never to look Ellen in the eye. Others described coldness, distance, even punishment for trivial mistakes. Whether every story was true or not no longer mattered. What mattered was the fracture that appeared in her image. The woman who had ended every episode with "be kind to one another" was now accused of embodying the opposite, and that contradiction cut deeper than any single rumor. What began as a ripple became a tidal wave. Old clips resurfaced. Interviews once dismissed as awkward humor now replayed as evidence of something darker. Mariah Carey caught off guard. Dakota Johnson pushing back gently. Taylor Swift blinking away tears. Fans who had once laughed now winced, watching through different eyes. The phrase, "replace Ellen," trended across platforms, and the internet, which had once been her playground, now turned into her jury. Then came the breaking point. On July 16, 2020, BuzzFeed News published an investigation that crystallized the whispers into headlines. 10 former employees spoke of what they described as a toxic workplace: fear, intimidation, rules that made staff feel invisible. The most shocking were the accusations against 3 senior producers facing claims of misconduct that shook even longtime admirers of the show. Within days, Warner Media announced an internal investigation. The executives were swiftly removed, but the damage to Ellen's kingdom of kindness was already done. When the new season premiered that September, Ellen addressed the controversy directly. Standing beneath the bright lights, she spoke the words that once carried so much authority. "I take responsibility for what happens at my show. This is the Ellen DeGeneres show. I am Ellen DeGeneres." She apologized, admitting that the workplace behind her smiling brand had not lived up to the values she had preached for years. For some, it was a moment of humility. For others, the words rang hollow, softened by nervous jokes that felt out of place. The apology was heard, but it did not heal. The damage was already etched too deeply. Ratings fell by more than 1 million. Within months, sponsors pulled away, and the reservoir of public trust, once her strongest currency, drained faster than it could be restored. Even as loyal voices like Katy Perry and Kevin Hart stood by her, others such as Brad Garrett and Leah Thompson confirmed that the stories were real. What had once been America's most cheerful sanctuary of laughter now lived under a shadow it could not escape. In May 2021, Ellen announced that season 19 would be her last. She explained that after nearly 2 decades, the show was no longer a challenge, but the timing spoke louder than her words. For those who had watched her rise from late-night sets to daytime royalty, the announcement felt less like a choice and more like a surrender, a woman forced to walk away from the very stage that had once been her sanctuary. When the final episode aired in May 2022, Jennifer Aniston, the guest from her very first show, returned to close the circle. It should have been a victory lap, but instead it felt like a farewell wrapped in unease. The studio filled with applause. There were tears and words of gratitude, yet under the celebration lingered tension and silence, as if everyone in the room knew this ending was not written by triumph, but by storm. Ellen smiled, but the radiance that had once defined her seemed dimmed, her laughter edged with exhaustion. For nearly 2 decades, that stage had been her second home, her refuge, her heartbeat. Now she was saying goodbye to it, not because she wanted to, but because she could no longer outrun the shadow that had fallen over it. And so an era ended, not in the blaze of triumph she had once dreamed of, but in the haze of contradiction. The Ellen DeGeneres Show had given joy to millions, reshaped daytime television, and made kindness part of the cultural fabric, yet in its final chapter, it became a reminder of how fragile legacies truly are, how decades of work can be undone by doubt, how the distance between image and reality can turn applause into questions. For Ellen, it was a heartbreak far beyond ratings or headlines. It was watching the very trust she had built, brick by brick, joke by joke, kindness by kindness, begin to unravel before her eyes. The stage that once crowned her now became a mirror, reflecting both her brightest light and her darkest shadow. It is heartbreaking, it is humbling, but above all it is human. Ellen's fall did not erase the good she had done, nor did it excuse the pain some said they endured. It revealed a truth too often forgotten. No one, not even those celebrated as larger than life, can carry perfection. And perhaps that was the cruelest irony of all. After surviving childhood shadows, professional exile, and cultural backlash, she now faced the deepest wound yet. That the words she had spoken at the end of every show, "Be kind to one another," became both her greatest gift and her heaviest burden. What about love? For Ellen, love was never gentle. It was a battlefield where the cost of honesty was measured in wounds. In 1997, just as she bared her truth to the world in the now legendary Puppy episode, she walked onto the red carpet of Volcano holding the hand of actress Anne Heche. That simple act, a smile, 2 women standing together without apology, was enough to set America ablaze. It was not just romance. It was defiance. It was courage stitched into the fragile fabric of love. But the price was merciless. Hollywood recoiled, its doors closing one by one. Ellen, already reeling from the backlash of coming out, found her career slipping through her fingers, contracts vanishing, sponsors retreating. The phone that once rang with offers now echoed with silence. For Anne, the toll was equally brutal. A family unable to embrace her truth, tabloids circling like vultures, an industry that branded their love not as human but as scandal. Behind the glossy photographs of 2 women smiling bravely, there lived a storm of fear, rejection, and exhaustion. What should have been a celebration of authenticity became instead a crucifixion under the unforgiving glare of a world not yet ready. Their relationship lasted until 2000, a love that burned fiercely but was slowly suffocated by the weight of a society that punished them for daring to exist openly. When it ended, neither woman walked away unscarred. Ellen withdrew once more into silence, carrying the familiar wound of being punished for her truth. But for Anne, the road grew darker. She stumbled through years of turbulence. Her battles with mental health laid bare under the unforgiving glare of the media. What should have been private struggles became public spectacle. Every misstep amplified, every fracture dissected. And then, in 2022, came the tragedy that silenced her forever. A car crash, violent and final, claimed Anne's life at just 53 years old. It was a cruel ending to a life that had already carried more storms than most could endure. For many, her death was a headline. For those who remembered her love with Ellen, it was a haunting reminder of how fragile and costly authenticity had been in those years. What began as a love that dared to shine became a story marked by scars and ended in a silence no one could ever fill. Looking back, their love was not failure but sacrifice. It was a love ahead of its time, and because of that, it bore the cruelty of its time. They paid in reputation, in career, in peace of mind, so that others might one day love more freely. And that is perhaps the cruelest truth. What cost them nearly everything would become the very foundation of freedoms others now inherit. Their story was not just about two women in love, but about the relentless weight of a society unready for honesty and the scars that honesty left behind. After, Ellen's heart longed for steadiness, for a love that did not feel like standing on the front lines of a cultural war. In 2001, she found companionship with photographer and actress Alexandra Hedison. Alexandra was calm, thoughtful, an artist who captured fragments of life through her lens and seemed to see the world with gentler eyes. With her, Ellen discovered a quieter chapter after the storm. A home filled not with headlines and scrutiny, but with long conversations, shared creativity, and moments that felt almost ordinary. For a woman who had lived through fire, ordinary was its own kind of miracle. Their relationship lasted 3 years, marked by affection and a search for normalcy. Together they built routines, celebrated small joys, and tried to carve out a private sanctuary away from the noise of Hollywood. But beneath the calm, cracks began to show. Ellen was still mending from the scars of her very public love with Anne, still haunted by the weight of a career rebuilding itself under constant watch. Alexandra, steady as she was, often found herself loving a woman whose spirit was restless, caught between gratitude for the quiet and a hunger for something larger, something that could both heal and inspire. The pressures of their different worlds, Ellen still in the spotlight, Alexandra drawn to a more private artistic life, slowly widened the distance between them. What began as a refuge started to feel like a pause, a temporary harbor rather than a permanent home. By 2004, they quietly parted ways, not with scandal or bitterness, but with the quiet sorrow of two people who cared deeply, yet could not bridge the gap between what they needed and what they could give. Looking back, Alexandra represented transition, the necessary space between heartbreak and healing, the bridge Ellen had to cross before stepping into the enduring love that awaited her. If Anne had been the fire that tested her courage, Alexandra was the stillness that gave her room to breathe, to remember that love could be gentle, even if it was not forever. And though their paths diverged, that chapter remained vital, for it prepared Ellen to recognize and embrace the love that would soon anchor her through the greatest storms of her life, Portia D. Rossi. By 2004, Ellen DeGeneres, then 46 years old, was a woman scarred by storms that would have broken many. She had lost a love that burned too brightly in Anne H., passed through the fragile refuge of Alexandra H., and carried wounds both public and private. She was bruised, weary, and almost convinced that permanence was not hers to have. And it was then, in the quiet of that exhaustion, that she crossed paths with Portia D. Rossi, then 31, a meeting that did not just change her life, it saved it. Portia, the elegant Australian actress known for Ali McBeal and Arrested Development, wore her own hidden scars. Beneath the beauty and the fame, she battled eating disorders, depression, and the crushing weight of hiding her true self in an industry ruthless with judgment. Like Ellen, she had learned to smile for the cameras while silently breaking inside. When their eyes met, it was not just attraction, it was recognition. Two women, both battered by expectation, finally saw in each other a mirror that did not judge but understood. And from that moment, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in years, Ellen felt her laughter come from joy rather than defense, and Portia discovered a love that saw her not as an image, but as a soul. Their days together were not just companionship, but healing. Quiet breakfasts shared in kitchens filled with sunlight. Long walks where conversation flowed into silence more comforting than applause. The simple miracle of waking up beside someone who made the world feel safe. Ellen once said, "Portia made me feel more loved than I ever imagined possible." And Portia, in turn, described Ellen as her soulmate, the anchor who steadied her storms. Their bond was instant but deliberate, built not on impulse but on a deep hunger for truth. In 2005, they chose to walk into the light together, hand in hand, refusing apology. In a Hollywood still chained by whispers, Their love was an act of rebellion. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was honest. And honesty was all either of them had left to give. Slowly, the world began to shift. In 2008, when California briefly opened its doors to marriage equality, they seized the chance with hands that had already held each other through storms. In an intimate ceremony at their Beverly Hills home, the rooms filled not with glamour, but with warmth. Friends wiping tears, family embracing, laughter mingling with the sound of vows spoken in trembling voices. Ellen, then 50, stood radiant with disbelief that a promise she once thought impossible was finally unfolding before her eyes. Portia, 35, glowed with a serenity she had long been denied, stepping into a safe harbor after years of exile from herself. Their vows were not just words. They were confessions, scars turned into promises, wounds transformed into hope. Ellen pledged not only to love but to protect, to stand as fiercely in silence as in applause. Portia vowed not only to stay, but to heal, to let herself be seen fully, without disguise, without fear. When they sealed those vows with a kiss, it was more than two women marrying. It was history bending, a victory carved out of decades of prejudice. That night, their home was alive with joy. Flowers scattered across tables, music echoing softly, friends toasting to a love that had refused to be erased. Ellen later said she felt like the luckiest woman alive, while Portia described the day as the first time she felt completely whole. No longer fugitives of love, they became its pioneers, standing as living proof that authenticity, though costly, could also be liberating, and that sometimes love is not only a private salvation, but a public revolution. But love, even one written in destiny, is never free of struggle. The vows exchanged in 2008 did not erase Portia's private battles with self-image and mental health, nor did they lighten the crushing demands that fame placed on Ellen's shoulders. There were nights when hospital corridors became their only shared space, when whispered reassurances replaced laughter, when doubt threatened to return like an old enemy. Yet, unlike the loves before, Ellen did not retreat into silence or distance. She stayed. She chose love not only in the glow of applause, but in the shadows of fear. And Portia, in turn, became her anchor, the steady, unshakable presence who held Ellen's hand when the roar of the world grew deafening. That loyalty was tested most fiercely in 2020, when Ellen's legacy trembled under the weight of controversy and the internet turned its gaze mercilessly cold. Headlines mocked, sponsors fled, millions who once cheered now questioned, but Portia did not flinch. She stood firm both publicly and privately, her quiet strength louder than any storm. In a moment that cut through the noise, she posted 4 words that became a lifeline. "I stand by Ellen." It was more than a declaration. It was a vow renewed, proof that when the world's trust fractured, the bond of love held steady. Ellen later called Portia her soulmate, confessing, "Portia has made me feel more loved than I ever thought possible." Nearly 2 decades after their first meeting, Ellen and Portia remain inseparable. Their homes, from Beverly Hills to Montecito, and now a retreat in the English countryside, are sanctuaries filled with art, animals, and gardens, each space a canvas for the life they built together. They have traded red carpets for quiet mornings, headlines for the sound of wind moving through trees. Ellen, who once rehearsed jokes alone in a cracked mirror, now wakes beside the woman who restored her peace. Portia, who once starved herself, under the weight of expectation, now thrives beside a partner who sees her not as an image, but as a human being worth cherishing. Their love is not flawless, but it is enduring. It has survived scrutiny, illness, distance, and the shifting tides of fame. It has turned pain into partnership, silence into solidarity, fear into family. If Anne was the fire that tested Ellen's courage, and Alexandra the bridge that carried her across heartbreak, then Portia is the harbor, the final steady light where a restless soul found rest. For Ellen, after decades of chasing laughter and outrunning storms, the greatest triumph was never a show, an award, or even a legacy. It was love, the kind that heals wounds invisible to the world, that stays when the cameras turn away, that endures when applause fades. And in Portia de Rossi, she found not just a partner, but the undeniable proof that even the most fractured lives can be made whole again. Their story is not merely about survival, it is about redemption, resilience, and the rarest miracle of all, finding home in another heart. There are storms that break suddenly, and there are storms that creep in quietly, disguised as the passing of time. For Ellen DeGeneres, now in her late 60s and edging towards 70, the storms were no longer headlines or scandal. They were her own body slowly turning against her. She spoke of it openly for the first time in 2023 at age 65, admitting what she had long carried in silence. Osteoporosis, a disease that thins the bones until even a simple misstep could mean a fracture. Arthritis, swelling, and stiffening. Her joints so that mornings became a battle before the day even began. And the twin burdens of the mind, obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, with its relentless rituals, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, with its restless scatter of thought, each pulling her in different directions, each making the simplest tasks exhausting. "I always thought I was just restless," she confessed. "But now I know my brain never stopped running and my body can't always keep up." It was a rare moment of candor, stripped of the armor of comedy, where honesty weighed heavier than punchlines. And it did not end there. As she approached 70, Ellen revealed that the toll of age had deepened. Chronic back pain from osteoporosis pressing on her spine, sharper flares of arthritis in her knees and hands, fatigue that lingered no matter how much she rested. These were not passing discomforts. They were permanent companions, daily reminders that the body, no matter how celebrated, bends to time. For a woman once defined by her energy, dancing, running across stages, filling rooms with laughter, the betrayal of her own bones and joints was the cruelest irony. The pain was not theatrical. It was relentless, unyielding, woven into the fabric of each day. Mornings no longer began with ease, but with joints so stiff she had to pause at the edge of the bed, breathing slowly before daring to stand. Hands, that once moved effortlessly, punctuating punchlines with flair, now trembled from the strain of opening a jar or lifting a cup. Even the simplest walk brought sharp protests from her knees and hips, reminders that her body was no longer the boundless engine it once had been. Nights carried their own punishments. Sleep fractured by sudden aches, thoughts looping endlessly. The knowing anxiety of a mind that refused to rest. For a woman once electrified by motion, adored for energy that seemed inexhaustible. This betrayal by her own flesh was harsher than any critic's words. Fame and scandal had scarred her, yes, but age had humbled her in ways nothing else could, forcing her to confront fragility without disguise. And yet Ellen did not collapse beneath it. She chose to adapt, to meet decline with defiance. Therapy was no longer optional, but a lifeline. She spoke candidly of reshaping her days around gentler rhythms, slow stretches instead of dances, measured walks instead of sprints, meditation, to calm the restless spirals of her mind, and the courage to decline demands that once defined her career. Therapy, she said, is a mirror I can finally look into without making a joke. It was an admission that stripped away her public armor, revealing not the entertainer, but the human being, one learning at last to treat herself with tenderness. Through it all, Portia became more than a partner. She became the guardian of Ellen's survival. She matched her steps to Ellen's slowing pace, offered her arm when joints threatened to give way, and redesigned their home into a sanctuary of comfort and healing. Softer chairs replaced rigid ones. Meals were crafted to nourish fragile bones. Garden paths were shaped to invite gentle movement. In interviews, Ellen smiled with a mix of humor and sincerity. "Portia makes me eat what I don't want to eat and move when I don't want to move." And she does it with love. That sentence was more than banter. It was truth. What might have been years of decline became, in their hands, years of partnership, endurance, and care. The loyalty Portia had shown in 2020 when Ellen's reputation was battered grew even deeper in these quiet battles. She did not need grand declarations. Her presence spoke louder. She held Ellen's hand through medical checkups, sat quietly beside her during therapy, and reminded her in 100 small ways that love could outlast scandal, time, and even the betrayal of the body itself. Their retreat to England was not an escape, but a choice to exchange the roar of applause for bird song, the glare of red carpets for the serenity of garden paths. Every step they counted together was no longer about performance. It was about progress, survival, and shared strength. Ellen confessed in 2024, her voice softer but steadier than before. I used to think success was being everywhere. Now success is just waking up, stretching, walking with Portia, and being grateful. In that quiet redefinition lay her greatest wisdom. To watch her slow, to see a body once so full of motion falter, is heartbreaking, yet within that heartbreak is inspiration, for she now speaks directly to anyone who has felt the slow betrayal of age, anyone who has looked in the mirror and seen fragility staring back. Her story is not one of defeat, but of resilience, of the grace it takes to endure, and of the rarest gift, a partner whose love turns frailty into strength. And so Ellen's later years are not defined by scandal or even comedy, but by testimony. The body will weaken, the mind will wander, storms will always come, yet with honesty, gentleness, and the steadfast hand of love, even the cruelest truths of aging can be borne. For the woman who once made the world laugh, the final act is no longer about laughter. It is about survival touched with grace, and about proving that kindness, when turned inward and shared with the one who stays, is the purest form of triumph. By 2024, Ellen DeGeneres had learned to live with slower steps, but she refused to vanish quietly. If her body was no longer built for endless motion, her voice still carried weight, and she chose to use it one last time. That year, she returned to the stage with a farewell stand-up tour titled Ellen's Last Stand, and a Netflix special pointedly named For Your Approval. "Yes, I'll talk about it," she promised at the opening, and for the first time in years, audiences leaned in not just for punchlines, but for truth. What followed was part confession, part comedy, part goodbye. Stories of fame's cruelty, reflections on aging, admissions of her flaws, and flashes of the razor wit that once made her unstoppable. The laughter was tinged with melancholy, as if everyone in the room understood this was not merely entertainment, but the last chapter of a woman closing her own book. When the curtain finally fell, Ellen did not chase another spotlight. Instead, she and Portia withdrew from Hollywood's glare and chose the quiet embrace of the English countryside. By 2025, with Ellen approaching 70, their home in the Cotswolds, surrounded by rolling hills, winding lanes, and stone cottages centuries old, had become a sanctuary far removed from red carpets. Mornings there arrived not with studio applause, but with mist curling over fields and birdsong drifting through open windows. Days were measured in the rhythm of gardening, the rustle of pages from Portia's art books, and the presence of beloved animals that roam freely across their land. Though Ellen stepped back from show business, she never abandoned her old passion for houses. With Portia, she continues to buy and restore properties, transforming them into havens of light and simplicity before passing them on. What was once a frenzied game of flipping multi-million-dollar estates in Beverly Hills and Montecito has slowed into a gentler pursuit. Less about profit, more about creating beauty. Even so, the scale of her empire remains staggering. Over the years, she has bought and sold more than 20 luxury homes, and today her net worth is estimated around $450 million, vast wealth by any measure. Yet the irony is cruel. No fortune can silence the ache in her bones, the stiffness of her joints, the restless storm of her mind. From the outside, she lives in near-ideal peace. Gardens in bloom, art-filled rooms, Portia always near. But inside, Ellen knows the cost of her journey. She admits in quieter moments that fame brought her not only laughter but also loneliness, and that her sharpest jokes sometimes hid her sharpest wounds. The controversies that once threatened to erase her legacy still linger like shadows on a bright wall, and age with its daily indignities forces her to face regrets she cannot rewrite. The relationships lost, the trust broken, the years when ambition drowned out gentleness. Yet amidst fragility, love has endured. Therapy helps her manage the relentless tug of OCD and ADHD. Gentle walks with Portia keep her body moving when arthritis demands stillness. And the marriage she once thought impossible has become her strongest fortress. Of all the treasures Ellen holds, art collections, sprawling estates, millions in the bank, none compares to the quiet evenings when she and Portia sit together in their garden, the world reduced to two voices, two hands, two hearts that have outlasted storms. It is a life both enviable and humbling, immense wealth balanced against the unyielding truth of mortality, public triumph shadowed by private regret. For Ellen DeGeneres, England is not an escape, but a reckoning, a place where she can finally slow down, breathe, and accept that legacy is not built in fortune or fame, but in the courage to keep living honestly, even when the spotlight has dimmed. The contrast could not be more striking. This was the same woman who once stood at the beating heart of American pop culture, whose quick wit, impeccable timing, and fearless originality transformed comedy from smoky club stages into living rooms across the nation. For 19 seasons, she turned daytime television into a cathedral of laughter, dance, and generosity, making audiences feel less like viewers and more like companions in her orbit. She commanded the world's biggest stages, hosting the Oscars, the Grammys, and the Emmys. With a blend of sharp intelligence and effortless charm that few could match, she breathed life into Dory, Pixar's unforgettable blue tang, her voice etching itself into global memory as a symbol of innocence and hope. And when she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2016, it was not just for her humor, but for her cultural impact, the rare ability to shift hearts, open minds, and redefine what was possible for someone brave enough to stand as herself. Yet this was also the woman who endured devastating backlash. The collapse of her sitcom after she came out in 1997, the storm of 2020 that questioned the very kindness on which she had built her empire. Ellen DeGeneres' legacy is not pristine, not unbroken, but perhaps that imperfection is what makes her talent and her triumphs even more remarkable. A brilliance that shone not because life was easy, but because she refused to let the shadows extinguish her light. To measure her life by perfection is to miss the truth of her story. Her greatness was never in being flawless, but in daring again and again to live in the open, even when the cost was staggering. In 1997, she taught the world that authenticity can be punished, yet it can also shift culture forever. In her talk show years, she proved that laughter, generosity, and visibility could reach into millions of homes and soften the edges of loneliness. And in her later struggles, she revealed something harder, more uncomfortable, but deeply necessary. That kindness must be lived, not just spoken. That even the most admired figures stumble. That legacies are not carved in marble, but stitched from triumphs and regrets alike. A legacy is not a spotless portrait. It's a canvas of starts and restarts, failures and grace, a critic wrote near her retirement. And perhaps that is the truest way to honor Ellen. Not to erase the shadows from her story, nor to excuse them, but to recognize the courage of someone who kept walking through them. For those who once found comfort in her laughter, there is something more enduring now, the reminder that storms will come, bodies will falter, reputations will bend, but honesty, resilience, and love can still carry us home. So whether you admired her or doubted her, if her voice ever filled the silence of a lonely afternoon, leave a line of thanks below and share with us what part of her journey stays with you most. The laughter, the resilience, the storms, or the way she kept finding her way back to the stage.